On November 22, 1943, a 33-year-old mining engineer stood on top of a concrete fortress filled with 150 men who wanted him dead, directing fire into its smoking entrances, while enemy soldiers charged up the sand behind him. And in the next 4 minutes, he would solve a problem that had killed hundreds of Marines that morning and rewrite how America would fight for the rest of the Pacific War. His name was Alexander Bonnyman, and this is the story of how a man who understood rocks and explosives better than he understood military doctrine turned the bloodiest failure of the Tarawa invasion into its most decisive victory, and why it cost him everything. The Battle of Tarawa began 3 days earlier, on November 20, 1943, when the United States Marine Corps launched its first major amphibious assault in the Central Pacific, targeting a tiny coral atoll called Bitio in the Tarawa Atoll of the Gilbert Islands. The operation was supposed to demonstrate American amphibious capability, to prove that the island-hopping strategy could work, that heavily fortified Japanese positions could be taken by coordinated naval bombardment and aggressive infantry assault. Instead, it became a catastrophe almost immediately. The naval bombardment, despite its intensity, barely scratched the Japanese defenses. The tides were wrong. The intelligence was incomplete. The Marines landed in chest-deep water hundreds of yards from shore, wading through machine gun fire that turned the lagoon into a killing field. Bodies floated in the surf. Equipment sank. Entire platoons were cut down before they reached dry sand. By nightfall on the first day, the Marines held only scattered positions along the beach, pinned down by interlocking fields of fire from bunkers that seemed indestructible. Bitio Island was less than 3 miles long and barely 800 yards wide at its widest point, a flat strip of coral and sand dominated by a Japanese airfield. But size meant nothing when every inch was fortified. The Japanese had spent more than a year transforming this tiny island into what they believed was an impregnable fortress. They had built more than 500 pillboxes, bunkers, and fortified positions, many constructed from steel-reinforced concrete several feet thick, topped with layers of coconut logs, coral, and sand. They had dug interconnected trenches, established overlapping kill zones, positioned artillery and machine guns with interlocking fields of fire. The entire defensive system was designed by Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, who reportedly boasted that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. He had 1,400 construction workers and 2,800 elite troops from the Special Naval Landing Forces, Japan's equivalent to Marines, men trained specifically for the brutal close-quarters combat of island defense. The fortifications were not just numerous, they were intelligently designed. The bunkers were positioned to support each other, so that attacking one meant exposing yourself to fire from 2 others. The concrete walls were thick enough to withstand direct hits from naval guns. The ventilation systems allowed defenders to breathe even when flamethrowers were used outside. The entrances were angled to prevent direct fire from reaching inside, and many bunkers had multiple exits, allowing defenders to escape one entrance, circle around, and counterattack from another angle. This was modern defensive engineering at its most sophisticated, and it neutralized almost every advantage the Americans thought they had. By the morning of November 22, the 3rd day of the battle, the Marines had clawed their way inland, taking horrific casualties for every yard. The beach was still littered with bodies. Medical stations overflowed. Ammunition was running low. Water was scarce. The heat was unbearable, the smell of death overwhelming. Yet the Japanese defenses held in several critical sectors, and none more importantly than a massive bunker complex near the southern coast of the island, in an area the Marines called the Pocket. This wasn't just another pillbox. This was a command and logistics center, a reinforced concrete structure that rose more than 15 feet above the sand, covered with additional layers of coral and coconut logs, with at least 5 separate entrances and firing positions that covered multiple approaches. Inside were approximately 150 Japanese soldiers, well-armed, well-supplied, and determined to fight to the death. The Marines had tried everything. They had called in artillery, but the shells either bounced off the concrete or buried themselves in the sand without detonating properly. They had tried frontal assaults, but the interlocking machine gun fire cut them down before they could get close. They had brought up flamethrowers, but the operators were shot before they could get into effective range, or when they did spray fire into an entrance, the defenders simply retreated deeper into the bunker, waited for the flames to subside, and resumed firing. Bangalore torpedoes were tried, demolition charges were placed, grenades were thrown into the entrances, but nothing worked. The bunker absorbed everything the Marines threw at it, and every hour it remained operational. It prevented the entire southern sector from being secured, which meant supplies couldn't be brought in, wounded couldn't be evacuated, and the entire beachhead remained vulnerable to counterattack. This was the problem First Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr. inherited when he was ordered to take his platoon and neutralize the bunker. Bonnyman was not a typical Marine officer. He had grown up in privilege, the son of a successful mining engineer in New Mexico, and had followed his father into the profession, studying at Princeton before leaving to work in the family's copper mines and fluorspar operations in New Mexico. He knew geology, explosives, and the physics of collapsing structures. He understood how rock formations fractured under pressure, how to calculate blast radii, how to place charges for maximum effect. He had spent years in mines, studying how earth and stone behaved under stress. When the war began, he could have stayed home, claimed an essential industry exemption, lived comfortably and safely. Instead, at age 33, married with 3 children, he enlisted in the Marines. Not because he was escaping anything, not because he had something to prove, but because he believed it was necessary. His superiors didn't quite know what to make of him. He was older than most junior officers, more educated, less interested in military ceremony and protocol. He asked too many questions. He challenged assumptions. He wanted to understand the why behind orders, not just follow them blindly. Some officers found this irritating. Others recognized that Bonnyman brought a different kind of intelligence to problems, a civilian expertise that military training didn't provide. And here, staring at this bunker that had already killed dozens of Marines and resisted every conventional tactic, that civilian expertise suddenly mattered more than any amount of infantry doctrine. Bonnyman studied the bunker the way an engineer studies a structure, not the way a soldier studies an enemy position. He observed the angles of the entrances, the thickness of the walls, the spacing of the firing ports. He noted where previous assaults had failed and why. He watched how the defenders responded to different threats, where they concentrated their fire, how quickly they could shift positions. And he realized something that should have been obvious but somehow wasn't. This wasn't a military problem, it was an engineering problem. The bunker couldn't be destroyed from the outside with the weapons they had. The concrete was too thick, the coverage too complete, but it could be sealed. And once sealed, it could be collapsed from within or rendered useless. The principle was simple, but the execution would be extraordinarily dangerous. The bunker had multiple entrances, which gave the defenders flexibility and made it nearly impossible to suppress all of them simultaneously. But those multiple entrances also meant multiple points of structural weakness. If Bonnyman could coordinate attacks on all entrances at the same time, if he could use flamethrowers and demolitions not to kill the defenders directly, but to seal the openings, to fill them with burning fuel and explosive debris, to create enough smoke and heat and chaos that the defenders couldn't effectively respond, then he could create the conditions for a final assault. It required precision timing, absolute coordination, and someone willing to expose themselves to direct fire to direct the operation. Bonnyman gathered his platoon and several attached engineers and flamethrower teams. He explained the plan methodically, pointing out each entrance, assigning specific teams to each one, describing the timing down to the second. The flamethrower teams would go first, spraying jellied gasoline into the entrances, creating walls of fire that would force the defenders back. Immediately behind them, engineers would throw in thermite grenades, which burned hot enough to melt steel and would create additional smoke and toxic fumes. Then demolition charges would be placed and detonated, collapsing portions of the entrance tunnels. The goal wasn't to kill everyone inside in one coordinated blast. It was to systematically deny them the ability to fight back, to turn their fortress into a tomb. But someone had to coordinate all of this in real time, adjusting for what worked and what didn't, directing fire, identifying which entrances were successfully sealed and which needed more attention. And that person would have to be in the open on top of the bunker itself, fully exposed to enemy fire from the bunker and from other Japanese positions nearby. Bonnyman assigned that role to himself. Not because he was suicidal, not because he was trying to be a hero, but because he was the only one who fully understood the engineering logic of what they were trying to do, and he knew that real-time adjustments would be necessary. If something went wrong, if the timing was off, if an entrance wasn't properly sealed, he needed to be able to see it and respond immediately. The assault began in the early afternoon, under a sun that made the coral sand almost unbearably hot and the air shimmer with heat distortion. Bonnyman moved forward with his teams, crouching low as they approached the base of the bunker. Japanese machine gun fire tore through the air above them, kicking up sand, ricocheting off coral rocks. One of the flamethrower operators went down, shot through the chest before he could fire. Another Marine grabbed the flamethrower, stumbled forward, and unleashed a stream of burning fuel into the nearest entrance. The jellied gasoline clung to everything it touched, spreading fire across the entrance and several feet into the tunnel beyond. The smell was immediate and overwhelming. Burning fuel, burning wood, something else, something worse. Thermite grenades followed, white-hot magnesium igniting with an intense light that was painful to look at directly. The smoke thickened, black and oily, pouring out of the entrance. From inside the bunker came the sound of shouting, then sustained rifle fire, bullets punching through the smoke blindly. Bonnyman was already moving to the second entrance, directing the next team into position. Another flamethrower burst, another cloud of fire and smoke. The third entrance was on the opposite side of the bunker, requiring the team to move through an exposed area under direct observation from other Japanese positions. 2 Marines were hit crossing that gap, but the remaining members of the team made it, and the flamethrower operator managed to spray a sustained burst before taking cover. Now came the critical moment. Bonnyman needed to get on top of the bunker to see all the entrances simultaneously, to determine which ones were successfully suppressed and which still posed a threat. He grabbed a satchel charge, slung his rifle across his back, and began climbing the side of the bunker. The surface was rough concrete covered with sand and debris, providing just enough purchase. Japanese soldiers inside could hear him climbing. Fire erupted from one of the entrances, bullets stitching across the concrete inches from his hands. He flattened himself against the surface, waited for the burst to end, then continued climbing. From the top of the bunker, the entire battlefield was visible in brutal clarity. To the north, Marines were still engaged in heavy fighting near the airfield. To the east, smoke rose from burning fuel dumps. Bodies lay scattered across the sand, American and Japanese, some moving, most not. And directly below him, he could see all 5 entrances to the bunker, could see which ones were still producing fire and which were effectively sealed. The southwest entrance was still active, with a machine gun positioned just inside the tunnel mouth, protected from direct assault by the angle of the entrance, but able to fire on anyone approaching from the beach. That entrance needed to be closed immediately, or the entire assault would stall. Bonnyman shouted orders to the team nearest that entrance, directing them to use a satchel charge rather than just a flamethrower. The team acknowledged, but before they could move, A group of Japanese soldiers burst out of the southeastern entrance, the one that had seemed most effectively suppressed. They had been waiting, enduring the heat and smoke, and now they launched a desperate counterattack, charging up the slope of the bunker directly at Bonnyman. There were perhaps a dozen of them, some with rifles, some with grenades, all screaming, all determined to kill the American officer who was orchestrating their destruction. Bonnyman unslung his rifle and opened fire. The first soldier went down immediately, then the second. The range was close, maybe 20 feet, and there was no room for missed shots. He fired steadily, methodically, the way someone who understands the mechanics of killing does, not with panic but with grim efficiency. A grenade landed near him, rolled slightly, and he had just enough time to kick it away before it detonated, the blast showering him with coral fragments and leaving his ears ringing. More Japanese soldiers came up the slope. He dropped his empty rifle, pulled his sidearm, and continued firing. Other Marines were firing now too, supporting him from below, but Bonnyman was the most exposed, the most obvious target, standing on top of the bunker like a statue in a shooting gallery. The counterattack broke. The surviving Japanese soldiers retreated back into the bunker or were cut down trying. Bonnyman reloaded, his hands moving automatically despite the adrenaline, despite the exhaustion. Below him, the demolition teams were placing final charges at the remaining active entrances. He could see the fuses being lit, could count down the seconds until detonation. The first charge went off with a sharp crack that momentarily drowned out all other sound, collapsing part of the entrance tunnel and sending a fresh cloud of dust and smoke into the air. The second charge followed, then the third. The southwest entrance, the one that had been most problematic, was now completely sealed, tons of concrete and coral blocking the tunnel. But sealing the entrances wasn't enough. The Japanese soldiers inside were still alive, still armed, and as long as they remained operational, they posed a threat. They could dig out, could wait for nightfall and launch a counterattack, could hold out for days if necessary. Bonnyman understood that the bunker had to be neutralized completely, permanently. He signaled for more demolition charges, heavier ones, enough to collapse the entire structure or at least destroy its structural integrity. Marines brought up several large satchel charges, each containing 20 pounds or more of high explosives. These would be placed at critical points along the bunker's roof and detonated simultaneously, creating enough force to either collapse the interior or create such massive overpressure that nothing inside could survive. Bonnyman personally placed the first charge, setting it near what he estimated was the central support column of the structure. His hands were steady, his movements precise, despite everything. This was engineering work, and he treated it with the same care he would have used placing charges in a mine shaft. The second charge went near the northern edge of the roof, the third near the southern. The fuses were synchronized as closely as possible given the circumstances, lit within seconds of each other. Bonnyman didn't have time to climb down. He flattened himself against the roof, covered his head with his arms, and waited. The detonations came almost simultaneously, 3 massive blasts that seemed to lift the entire bunker slightly before slamming it back down. The concussion was enormous, felt in the chest and skull, a physical force that drove the air from lungs and left ears useless. Cracks appeared in the concrete roof, spreading outward like spiderwebs. Smoke and dust erupted from every opening, from cracks that hadn't existed moments before, from seams in the concrete. The bunker was still standing, but it was no longer structurally sound. More importantly, the overpressure inside would have been catastrophic. Anyone who survived the initial blasts would be disoriented, injured, unable to fight effectively. Bonnyman stood up, assessed the damage, and prepared to direct the final assault, the infantry sweep that would clear any remaining defenders. But as he stood, exposed once again on the roof of the bunker, Japanese soldiers who had been positioned in a secondary trench line nearby opened fire. They had been watching, waiting for this moment, and now they had a clear shot. Multiple rifles fired simultaneously. Bonnyman was hit 3 times in rapid succession, rounds striking his chest and abdomen. The impact spun him partially around and he dropped to one knee, then to both knees. He tried to raise his rifle, couldn't, tried to stand, couldn't. Marines below were already returning fire, trying to suppress the Japanese position, but it was too late. First Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr. collapsed on top of the bunker he had just destroyed, his blood mixing with the coral dust and concrete debris. He was 33 years old. He had been in combat for less than 72 hours. He had been in the Pacific Theater for less than 6 months. And in the last 2 hours of his life, he had solved a tactical problem that had stumped dozens of more experienced officers, had personally led the assault that broke the most heavily fortified position on Batio Island, and had demonstrated a method of bunker warfare that would be studied and refined for the rest of the Pacific campaign. The immediate tactical impact of Bonnyman's actions was clear within hours. With the massive bunker complex destroyed, the entire southern sector of Batio Island could finally be secured. Supplies that had been bottlenecked on the beach could now be brought forward. Wounded Marines could be evacuated to ships offshore. Artillery could be positioned to support operations elsewhere on the island. The Japanese defensive line, which had held for nearly 3 full days, fractured. By the evening of November 23, organized Japanese resistance on Batio had effectively ended, though isolated groups of defenders would hold out for another day, and the final casualty count wouldn't be compiled for weeks. The cost of taking Tarawa shocked the American public when the news finally broke. More than 1,000 Marines were killed in action, with another 2,000 wounded, all in just 76 hours of fighting for an island less than 3 miles long. The casualty rate was staggering, higher than anything yet experienced in the Pacific, higher than most people thought was acceptable for such a small piece of coral. Newsreel footage showing bodies floating in the lagoon caused outrage and demands for investigations. Military planners were forced to completely reconsider amphibious assault doctrine, recognizing that naval bombardment alone could not neutralize well-constructed fortifications. That intelligence about tides and beach conditions was absolutely critical. That coordination between Navy and Marine units needed to be far more sophisticated. But there was another lesson from Tarawa, one less dramatic but ultimately more important for the future conduct of the war. Bonnyman's methodical, engineering-based approach to destroying fortified positions became a case study in Marine Corps training schools. His recognition that bunkers couldn't always be destroyed by frontal assault or overwhelming firepower, that they could instead be systematically sealed and collapsed, that civilian expertise in demolitions and structural engineering could be more valuable than traditional infantry tactics. This understanding filtered through the command structure and influenced how subsequent island assaults were planned and executed. At Iwo Jima in 1945, Marine engineers used refined versions of Bonnyman's techniques to neutralize Japanese cave systems and bunkers that were even more elaborate than those at Tarawa. They coordinated flamethrower teams with demolition units, sealed entrances methodically, used shaped charges to collapse tunnel systems, employed smoke and thermite to create conditions inside fortifications that made defense impossible. The tactics weren't identical. The specific circumstances were different, but the underlying logic was the same. Treat fortifications as engineering problems, not just military obstacles. Apply science and precision, not just courage and firepower. At Okinawa, the same principles applied to bunkers built into limestone ridges and hillsides, structures that were even more difficult to destroy because they were carved into solid rock rather than constructed from concrete. Marine and Army engineers adapted Bonnyman's systematic approach, learning to identify structural weaknesses, to coordinate multiple assault teams attacking different entrances simultaneously, to use demolitions not just to kill, but to collapse and seal. The casualty rates were still horrific, the fighting still brutal, but the tactical efficiency improved. Fortifications that might have held for days were reduced in hours. Positions that seemed impregnable were systematically dismantled. For Alexander Bonnyman Jr., none of this mattered. He died on top of that bunker on November 22, 1943, and was buried in a temporary grave on Batio Island along with dozens of other Marines. His family was notified that he had been killed in action. His wife and 3 children mourned him. The official citation for his Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously in 1947, described his actions in typically dry military language. Conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. It mentioned that he fearlessly exposed himself to heavy enemy fire, and that his heroic actions contributed materially to the success of the assault. It did not mention the engineering logic, the systematic problem-solving, the way he transformed a military disaster into a tactical template. And then, for decades, Alexander Bonnyman Jr. was forgotten by everyone except his family and a handful of military historians. His grave on Batio was lost, buried under subsequent construction and vegetation growth, its location unknown. The island changed hands, became part of the newly independent nation of Kiribati, and the battlefield where so many had died became overgrown and largely forgotten. The bunkers crumbled, the coral reclaimed what had been torn up, and the physical evidence of those terrible 76 hours slowly disappeared. But his family never forgot. His daughter, Alexandra Bonnyman Jr., spent years researching her father's service, trying to understand exactly what had happened on Batio Island, trying to piece together the final hours of his life from fragmentary reports and witness statements. In the early 2000s, she learned that an organization called History Flight was conducting recovery operations on Tarawa, searching for the remains of Marines who had never been brought home. She contacted them, provided what information she had about her father's burial location, and asked if there was any possibility of finding him after so many decades. The search was extraordinarily difficult. Batio Island had been completely transformed since 1943. Buildings covered much of the former battlefield. Records of grave locations were incomplete or contradictory. The island's government had limited resources and competing priorities. But History Flight persisted, using a combination of archival research, ground-penetrating radar, and systematic excavation. In May 2015, more than 70 years after the battle, they found remains in an area that matched the approximate location of Bonnyman's grave. Dental records and DNA analysis confirmed the identification. On September 27, 2015, First Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr. was buried with full military honors at the Bonnyman family plot in Knoxville, Tennessee. His daughter, by then in her 70s, was present. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren were present. Veterans from multiple wars attended, along with active-duty Marines and representatives from the Marine Corps and the Department of Defense. The ceremony was dignified and moving, a final acknowledgement of sacrifice that had occurred 3/4 of a century earlier. But perhaps more important than the ceremony itself was what it represented, the recognition that even decades later, even when memories have faded and battlefields have been reclaimed by nature or development, the specific actions of specific individuals still matter. Bonnyman's engineering approach to destroying that bunker on November 22, 1943, influenced Marine Corps doctrine for the rest of World War II and beyond. His willingness to expose himself to enemy fire to coordinate the assault, his decision to treat the problem as a technical challenge rather than just a military obstacle, his methodical application of demolitions and flamethrowers, all of this had ripple effects that probably saved lives in subsequent battles, that probably shortened the Pacific War by some unmeasurable but real amount. We tend to remember wars in broad strokes, the major battles, the famous generals, the turning points that everyone recognizes. But wars are also decided by small moments, by individual decisions made under impossible pressure, by people who bring unexpected expertise to problems that don't have textbook solutions. Alexander Bonnyman wasn't supposed to be the hero of Tarawa. He was supposed to be a middle-aged mining engineer in New Mexico, managing his family's business, raising his children in peacetime. Instead, he became a Marine lieutenant who understood that destroying a bunker required the same logic as collapsing a mine shaft, and who was willing to stand on top of that bunker, fully exposed, directing the operation even when it made him the most obvious target on the battlefield. There's something instructive about that, something worth remembering beyond the specific historical details. In any complex endeavor, whether it's war or engineering or business or science, the most important breakthroughs often come from people who approach problems differently, who bring knowledge from outside the standard framework, who ask, "What if we tried this?" rather than just following established doctrine. Bonnyman looked at that bunker and didn't see an impregnable fortress. He saw a structure with exploitable weaknesses, entrances that could be sealed, load-bearing elements that could be compromised. And because he could see the problem that way, because his years in mines had trained him to think about how structures fail under stress, he could devise a solution that pure military training hadn't suggested. The cost was his life. That's the part we can't romanticize or diminish. He solved the problem, but the solution required him to make himself a target, and eventually that target was hit. He left behind a wife and 3 children. He never saw his grandchildren, never knew that his remains would be recovered decades later, never knew that his tactical innovations would be studied by future generations of Marines. He just knew that the bunker had to be destroyed, that hundreds of Marines were dying because it hadn't been destroyed, and that he had the knowledge and authority to do something about it. In the decades after World War II, as the Marine Corps refined its amphibious assault doctrine, as analysts studied what had worked and what had failed across dozens of island battles, Bonnyman's actions at Tarawa were increasingly recognized as a pivotal moment in the evolution of infantry tactics against fortified positions. Training manuals explicitly referenced the coordinated use of flamethrowers, demolitions, and infantry assault that he had pioneered. Engineer officers studied his systematic approach to identifying and exploiting structural weaknesses in enemy fortifications. The specific techniques evolved and improved, but the underlying principle remained. Some military problems require engineering solutions, and sometimes the best person to solve those problems is someone who thinks like an engineer, not like a traditional infantry officer. This is not to say that traditional military training doesn't matter, or that courage and aggression aren't essential in combat. They absolutely are. But Tarawa demonstrated that they're not sufficient by themselves, not when facing an enemy who has months or years to prepare sophisticated defenses, who understands engineering as well as you do, who has calculated exactly how to maximize the defensive advantage of terrain and fortifications. Against such an enemy, you need people who can think laterally, who can recognize that the doctrine that worked in one situation might not work in another, who can adapt and improvise. Bonnyman's background gave him that capacity for lateral thinking. His years working in mines, calculating blast patterns, understanding how rock and earth respond to explosives, recognizing when a structure is about to fail, all of that provided a framework for analyzing the bunker problem that his military training alone wouldn't have supplied. And critically, his commanding officers recognized this and gave him the authority to implement his plan, even though it deviated from standard infantry assault doctrine. That willingness to trust subordinate expertise, to let the person closest to the problem devise the solution, was as important to the outcome as Bonnyman's technical knowledge. There's a broader point here about how organizations function under pressure, about when to follow established procedures, and when to deviate from them, about how to identify and empower the people with the right expertise for specific challenges. The Marine Corps in late 1943 was still learning these lessons. Earlier in the war, there might have been more rigid adherence to doctrine, more skepticism about unconventional approaches. But by Tarawa, enough things had gone wrong, enough assaults had failed despite overwhelming firepower, that there was institutional openness to trying something different. That openness created the space for Bonnyman to attempt his engineering solution, and the success of that solution reinforced the value of flexibility and lateral thinking. We see this pattern repeated throughout military history and beyond. The innovations that matter most often come from the edges of the organization, from people who bring different backgrounds and perspectives, who aren't fully indoctrinated into established ways of doing things. Sometimes this causes problems, when unconventional approaches fail spectacularly. But sometimes, as at Tarawa, it produces breakthroughs that change how everyone subsequently approaches similar challenges. The key is creating an organizational culture that can distinguish between reckless deviation from doctrine and intelligent adaptation to circumstances. Alexander Bonnyman Jr. exemplified intelligent adaptation. He didn't ignore military protocol out of arrogance or recklessness. He understood infantry tactics, understood combined arms operations, understood command structure. But he also understood that the specific problem in front of him, this massive reinforced bunker that had resisted every conventional assault, required a different approach. And when he implemented that approach, he did so with the same methodical precision that had characterized his civilian career, coordinating multiple assault teams, timing demolitions to maximum effect, personally observing and adjusting the operation in real time. The tragedy is that this kind of intelligent adaptation, this bringing of civilian expertise to military problems, inevitably carries enormous personal risk. Bonnyman couldn't coordinate the assault from a safe distance. He had to be on top of the bunker, visible to everyone, exposed to fire from multiple directions. His engineering solution worked, but implementing it required him to make himself a target, and in combat, being a target long enough will eventually get you killed. That's not heroism in the traditional sense, though it's certainly brave. It's more like the cold logic of problem-solving taken to its ultimate conclusion. This is what needs to happen. I'm the person best positioned to make it happen, and the personal risk is irrelevant compared to the tactical necessity. In the years since Tarawa, military historians and ethicists have debated whether such individual sacrifice should be celebrated or lamented, whether we should be training officers to think this way or teaching them to preserve their own lives so they can continue commanding. There's no clear answer. War creates impossible choices. Situations where every option involves unacceptable costs, where the least bad decision still results in good people dying. Bonnyman made his choice knowing the likely outcome, and his actions unquestionably saved other Marines' lives and contributed to the overall success of the operation. But he paid for that success with his life, leaving his family without a husband and father, and we should acknowledge that cost honestly rather than glossing over it with patriotic rhetoric. His daughter spent decades trying to understand her father, trying to piece together who he was beyond the official citations and military records. She learned that he had been thoughtful and methodical, that he had loved his work in the mines, that he had volunteered for the Marines despite having every reason to stay home, that his letters to his family during training revealed someone who took the responsibility of command seriously, who worried about his men, who approached military service with the same careful attention he had applied to engineering. She learned that other Marines who served with him remembered him as unusually calm under pressure, as someone who explained his reasoning rather than just giving orders, as an officer who seemed older and more settled than his rank suggested. And she learned that his death wasn't glorious or cinematic, that he had been shot by enemy soldiers who were themselves fighting desperately to defend their position, that he had fallen on top of the bunker and had died within minutes, probably knowing exactly what was happening, probably understanding in those final moments that his plan had worked, but that he wouldn't survive it. There's no evidence he had any final words, no dramatic last statement. He was simply there, directing the assault, and then he was hit, and then he was gone. That mundane reality of his death stands in sharp contrast to the extraordinary nature of his achievement. We want our heroes to have movie moments, dramatic last stands, inspiring final speeches. Bonnyman's actual death was probably confused and painful and quick, just another casualty in a battle that produced thousands of casualties. What made his death significant wasn't how it happened, but what he accomplished before it happened, the tactical breakthrough he engineered, the example he set for how to approach seemingly impossible problems. 70 years later, when his remains were finally recovered and returned to his family, the ceremony in Knoxville drew Marines from across the country, veterans who had never met Bonnyman but who had been trained using doctrine that descended directly from his innovations at Tarawa. They came to honor not just the man but what he represented, the idea that individual initiative and expertise matter, that solving hard problems sometimes requires thinking beyond standard procedures, that the people who change how wars are fought aren't always the generals making strategic decisions, but sometimes the junior officers making tactical innovations under fire. The question we should ask ourselves, sitting here 8 decades after Tarawa, is what we learn from Alexander Bonnyman's story beyond the historical specifics. We learn something about the value of diverse expertise, about how civilian knowledge can solve military problems. We learn something about organizational flexibility, about creating space for subordinates to devise unconventional solutions. We learn something about personal sacrifice, about the choices people make when confronting impossible situations. And we learn something about memory, about how long it can take to truly understand and appreciate individual contributions to collective outcomes. Tarawa was one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, a tactical victory won at terrible cost, an operation that forced the American military to completely reconsider its amphibious assault doctrine. But within that larger story are dozens of smaller stories of individual decisions and actions, of people like Alexander Bonnyman, who brought specific expertise to specific problems at specific moments, and whose contributions rippled forward through time, influencing events they never witnessed, saving lives they never knew existed. That's worth remembering, not with nostalgic sentimentality, but with clear-eyed recognition of what individual agency can accomplish, even in the most constrained and dangerous circumstances. So here's what I'd ask you to consider. In your own life, in your own work, when have you encountered a problem that standard approaches couldn't solve? When have you drawn on unexpected expertise or experience to devise an unconventional solution? And perhaps more importantly, when have you been in a position to empower someone else to try something different, to trust their expertise even when it challenges established procedures? Alexander Bonnyman didn't set out to revolutionize Marine Corps doctrine. He just applied the knowledge he had to the problem in front of him, and he was willing to take personal risk to implement the solution he believed would work. That combination of expertise, creative thinking, and courage is rare enough to be extraordinary, but common enough that we probably all encounter it occasionally, in ourselves or in others. The story of Tarawa and Bonnyman's actions there isn't fundamentally about war or the Pacific Campaign, or even about World War II specifically. It's about how human beings solve problems when the stakes are highest, when the pressure is unbearable, when failure means death for you and for the people depending on you. It's about bringing your whole self to a challenge, all your knowledge and experience and capability, and being willing to act even when you can't guarantee success. And it's about how individual actions in moments of crisis can create ripples that spread across time, influencing people and events far removed from the original moment.